I'm Peter Pham, Vice President of the Association for the Study of the Middle East and Africa and editor of the Journal of the Middle East and Africa, and it's delighted to have you in this morning's breakout session on Boko Haram. The subject of Boko Haram is an interesting one insofar as the attention it's received in the last year. I remember when the first congressional hearing on Boko Haram was held in 2011, and four of us testified at that hearing, actually. Myself, Lauren Blanchard, who is with us on the panel today, Africa Specialist with the Congressional Research Service, and also our editorial board member of the journal, Professor Ricardo Rene Laramont, and one other witness, Jennifer Cook of CSIS, testified. And four of us testified. 2 members of Congress bothered to show up, and 2 staffers. Altogether, we had about less than a dozen people in the room, counting Ricardo's wife and my deputy and 2 of my assistants. That was as much attention as was paid to Boko Haram. Well, fast forward 3 years later, and of course, the tremendously successful insofar as gaining attention, if not in actual results, social media campaign, et cetera, and we now, Boko Haram is almost a household word, and we even find leaders in the Middle East invoking the specter of Boko Haram, including on several occasions that I've noted, Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel. This panel today, I'm very delighted not only to have Lauren, who's carefully followed this, but one of the preeminent people who follow this very closely, especially on the security and terrorism side, Jacob Zenn, who's an Africa analyst at the Jamestown Foundation. So I think the biographies are in your program, so I won't stop too long on that, but get into our discussion. I'd like to first perhaps set a little parameter of the context for those of you who perhaps don't follow Boko Haram with the fixation at times bordering mania that some of us who are analysts of it do, set some basic context, and then turn to Jacob to give us an update on the security picture as well as the terrorism links, and then finally to Lauren for U.S. government policy and what we are or are not doing, and then open it up to discussion. To understand Boko Haram, one cannot understand Boko Haram without first disentangling some of the simplifications. First of all, the classic simplification often used by media of northern Nigeria being Muslim and the southern part of the country being Christian is true in a certain aggregate sense, but certainly given a much greater variety. There are large Christian communities in the north and not insignificant Muslim communities in the south and especially the southwest of Nigeria. And the north is not homogeneous, although most of the north of Nigeria, the predominant culture, House of Fulani, dating back to the Othman Den Fodio jihads of the 19th century, and certainly predominant in the Emirate states centered around the Sultanate of Sokoto. The northeastern part of Nigeria, although predominantly Muslim, traces its roots back to the Borno Empire, which spilled over into Niger, Chad, and parts of Cameroon. So culturally different, and the state of Borno, where Boko Haram was started and centered, the predominant group are the Kanuri. So in a sense, a minority within another minority in the north, and that sets a certain social context. Although the north has had traditionally Nigeria certainly is an Islamic culture, the northeastern part and the imposition of Islamist law, Sharia law, came only after, ironically, the reestablishment of constitutional order in Nigeria in 1999, when a number of politicians, primarily former associates of the former military regime, tried to rebrand themselves in the new dispensation and took to political Islamism as an easy tool to marshal the troops, so to speak, and gain a new legitimacy in the new dispensation. And for those of you interested in political Islam in northern Nigeria, I commend to you Professor Laramont's book on the subject. And full disclosure, I blurbed that in its time. But in the state of Borno State, one particular politician, Ali Modi, decided to run for political office as governor. And part of his campaign tactic was to reach out to this rather esoteric sect, Boko Haram, this movement with a rabble-rousing leader, Muhammad Yusuf, and use them as, if you will, the community organizers to rally electoral support. And it proved effective. He was elected governor in 2003, and in compensation appointed a leading Boko Haram member, a fellow named Al-Haji Buji Foy, to be the state commissioner of religious affairs, giving him control of the state budget for mosque and other Islamic affairs, some of which was diverted actually to the treasury of Boko Haram and specifically to Muhammad Yusuf's personal stake. And Muhammad Yusuf, like had a rather esoteric interpretation of Islam. He had some very strange notions about, among other things, rain and moisture and condensation and all those other things. So it was rather esoteric, certainly not what one would call classic Salafist or even traditional Sunni theology. But it was the deal worked, got resources. In fact, ultimately, when the group was crushed in 2009, one found all sorts of quite a number, several dozen motorcycles and numerous luxury cars and other things at the estate that Muhammad Yusuf had for himself. The alliance continued through the 2007 elections, after which the governor had ambitions of a national scale, which meant separating himself from this group, which increasingly had quarreled with local religious authorities, traditional religious leaders, and so began a 2-year period of tit-for-tat struggle between the governor and his former allies, all of which culminated in 2009 with a crackdown on Boko Haram, which led to the killing of several hundred members and certainly the extrajudicial execution of Muhammad Yusuf while in police custody. The group was thought crushed, but as it turns out, some members survived, went abroad, linked up most certainly with Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, received some training, some ideological flavor. There are disputes whether or not some went as far as Somalia and were trained in camps in what was then Al-Shabaab-held territory, returning in 2010, at which point they rebranded themselves, issued a number of videos, including one in which the former deputy of Boko Haram proclaimed himself the Amir, Abu Bakr Shekau, and he appears in video in what I call classic Al-Qaeda fashion, with fatigues, a turban, black flag, AK-47, and mutterings about crusaders, Iraq, and other things that Boko Haram had not shown much interest in previously. Group was largely dismissed, but then 2011 they proved that they actually did pick up some things, carrying out attacks in Abuja, the capital, far from their traditional lands in the northeast, including attacks on the Inspector General of the National Police Force of Nigeria and the suicide truck bombing of the UN compound in Abuja. Things have escalated since then through 2011, early 2012, numerous bombings, drive-by shootings, and other violence. 2012, I would argue, brought a change in the group with the takeover of northern Mali by Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb and allied groups, which enabled Boko Haram to establish at least 2 that we're generally aware of, training camps in northern Mali. That lasted, of course, until the French intervention, January 2013, when they were forced out, returning to Nigeria. And one could see after that period, beginning in 2013, a change yet again in what I call version 3.0 of Boko Haram, a change in tactics from hit and run and bombings to now increasingly sophisticated military attacks on weapons depots, freeing of prisoners, and gradually seizing control since the middle of 2013, control of local government areas, the rough equivalent of counties in northeastern Nigeria, to the point, and that has accelerated this year with a number of, especially during this past summer, a number of attacks where they've driven back the Nigerian army and occupied whole chunks of territory. Analysts will differ on how much territory, but certainly significant cities have fallen into their control, including just yesterday the hometown of the chief of the defense staff of Nigeria, Marshal Alex Bade's hometown of, the largest town near his actual home village, Mubi, a town of about 130,000 people, fell to them yesterday. So increasingly have sophisticated attacks, holding territory. And the other thing they've managed to do, apparently, although subject to denial by the Nigerian military and certain dispute among analysts, apparently on September 11th this year, managed to down a Nigerian Air Force Alpha jet, and subsequently there was a video release of the beheading of the crew of that flight, which, to point of comparison for those following military affairs, although ISIS, ISIL, or whatever we're calling it at the moment, in Iraq and Syria have managed to shoot down Iraqi-flown helicopters, they haven't managed to shoot down a military plane during operations, which Boko Haram apparently has managed to do. And of course, in the interim, they've jumped to everyone's attention through the kidnapping of the schoolgirls in Chibok, schoolgirls which have yet to be released. Some have escaped, and there have been, of course, recent reports of negotiations between the Nigerian government and Boko Haram over the release. The schoolgirls got most of the attention, but one has to also point out that low-level kidnappings have been part and parcel of the financing model of this group. Several hundred Nigerians are kidnapped every year, and the sweet spot seems to be people who are wealthy enough, mid-rank people, to have a nice chunk of change in their bank accounts to which to pay ransom, but not high profile or wealthy enough to have private security guards or countermeasures. So the average ransom seems to be between 10 to 20,000 US dollars per victim, paid quietly by the family, because one thing we know about Nigeria is you don't want the military intervening. I remember I was asked by the senior official of a foreign government when one of their nationals was captured, what to do. I said, I'll tell you what not to do, which is ask the Nigerians to rescue your people, otherwise you might as well start making funeral arrangements. Their record on that matter is rather dismal. Some kidnappings have occurred and ransoms have been paid, and that's part of the overall financing model. All this in the context of a region in northern Nigeria that is marginalized even within the greater north, and then certainly across the country. They've repeatedly voted for the opposition, and so that partially enters into the question of how much the government cares. And then, of course, ultimately with the government, we're facing in Nigeria the political context of elections due February 15th. The president is likely to announce his, in fact, is almost certain to announce his re-election bid, and that, of course, colors things as well, because it would be his final term in office. So this sets you a little bit of the context. It's certainly much more than the hashtag, much more than simplifications of, although there is the element of Islamism there, and certainly other parts, it's not entirely dispositive of the situation, and it has to be understood within the context of Nigeria's political, economic, and social challenges, which are, of course, manifold, and we can get into that in questions and answer. And certainly the incapacities of the Nigerian military are well known. One final anecdote to point out that during the period when the U.S. was more heavily involved earlier this year in the search for the girls, we had to send a predator, an unarmed predator, to the region to gather intelligence. The reason was that it wasn't that the Nigerians didn't own surveillance planes of their own. They actually bought a dozen Aerostars from Israel a couple of years back, but then neglected to, someone absconded with the money budgeted for maintenance, so when they needed them, not one of the Aerostars flew. So it's a bit of context there. So without further ado, really turn it over to one of the people who's really been following this very closely and intimately, Jacob Zenn.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for that introduction, which has provided a very solid basis for me to continue forward with a discussion of Boko Haram's leadership, composition, and goals. First, I want to give a lay of the land. In the northwest of Nigeria, what we mostly see are very high impact and large scale, but sporadic attacks. And the targets of these attacks are the enemies of the global jihadist movement, such as Christians and their churches, international organizations such as the UN, as well as foreign engineers who are kidnapped for ransom. This is largely a human security issue in the Northwest. And if you take a look at the case studies of the largest 10 to 20 attacks, you'll find that the network behind these attacks in the Northwest are largely Al-Qaeda in Islamic Maghreb, or AQIM, Ansaru, which was the AQIM extension in Nigeria led by Nigerian members of AQIM, who had been shifting south since the mid-2000s, and Boko Haram in the Northeast. In the Northeast, what we largely see is an insurgency. We see daily attacks ranging from highway robberies, where the people who are robbed are also killed, to attacks involving 700 militants on towns as big as 200,000 people, as well as on military barracks and other prisons. The targets of the insurgents in the Northeast are basically everyone who is not them or who is opposed to them. And in the Northeast, the insurgents are almost all members of Boko Haram's network. Any attack of substance in the Northeast cannot occur without that gang becoming a franchise of Boko Haram, or else they risk being killed themselves. What happens in the Northeast is a national security issue because it threatens to cut off that region from Nigeria, and that also has obvious regional and international ramifications. To make a comparison, we see 80 to 90% of total attacks in Borno State of northeastern Nigeria. However, the majority of large-scale suicide bombings or vehicle bombings take place in the Northwest. The reason for that is because Al-Qaeda or AQIM or its trainees in Ansaru exported that tactic into Nigeria. And that's why when commentators on Nigeria said in 2010 that we will never see suicide bombings in the country, they weren't necessarily wrong, but they may not have foreseen the way that Al-Qaeda would be able to import its tactics into the country, just like it has done in Indonesia and other countries of the world. To give a visual example of these networks, you can take a look at the Algerian national emblem, which has the setting sun symbolizing the Maghreb of Algeria and Morocco. Later, the GSPC, Group Salafist for Preaching and Combat, the predecessor to AQIM, before AQIM announced its affiliation with Al-Qaeda in 2007, adopted that sun logo. And later, Ansaru, as I said, the Nigerian AQIM extension in Nigeria, also adopted that sun logo. These types of propaganda materials were found in Mukhtar Belmokhtar's compound in Gao, Mali, and this is because Belmokhtar and other key GSPC, AQIM, and later Mujao leaders in northern Mali are all in the same network as Ansaru. Ansaru also tended to use Arabic language and dress in the Sahelian attire typical of groups like AQIM, and Ansaru claimed and was responsible for the kidnapping and killings of the British and Italian engineers in Kebbi Sokoto, the German engineer in Kano, 2012, French engineer in Katsina, 2013, who was later released as part of some broader deal or escaped, according to the official statement, as well as killing 7 foreign engineers in Bauchi in 2013. Boko Haram, in contrast, in the Northeast, is more of a domestically rooted movement that has reached out to gain any support that it can, including from Ansaru. And you can see it tends to use Hausa language and dress in the fatigues typical of Nigeria or the US that are green. Boko Haram's name is actually Jama'atu Ahl Sunnah li Dawati wal Jihad, which means the Sunni group for preaching and jihad. And it is called Boko Haram because locals perceived it to be against Western education, which is what Boko Haram means, but it's against a lot more than that, maybe Western civilization more broadly. The rest of the presentation will focus on Boko Haram. In terms of the operational environment of Boko Haram in the Northeast, I think you'll find many similarities with other jihadist operational environments around the world. For one, Borno State in the northeast is a remote wasteland with very little economic development and ecological issues due to shrinking Lake Chad and other forms of desertification, so there are not many jobs or economic vitality there. There's also a feeling of perceived relative deprivation, which can be traced to, as Dr. Pham said, the fact that northeastern Nigeria used to be part of the core of the Kanem-Borno Caliphate, which extended all the way to southern Libya in a succession of dynasties from about 900 to 1900. However, with the onset of colonialism, the leaders of that caliphate, the Kanuri people, were split into 4 countries: Nigeria, Niger, Cameroon, and Chad. And when they look around Nigeria in particular, they can see that in the northwest, there is the religious establishment of Nigeria today, which is led mostly by Hausas and Fulanis, who were the rivals of the Kanuris during the Caliphate era. The political center of Nigeria is in Abuja, and the economic power in Nigeria is with Lagos, Port Harcourt, and the oil industry in the south, which is populated mostly by Christians. So when Boko Haram adopted the ideology of tekfirism, which allowed it to call infidels basically all of these people who it views in opposition and then kill them, it created the conflagration that we've seen today. To make a comparison in global perspective, ISIS, too, is a Sunni Arab-based movement that has struggled in any way to expand beyond the Sunni Arab areas of Iraq and Syria, such as to Kurdish regions or Shia regions or Christian and Druze populated regions. The political power of Iraq is now with a Shia-led government close to Iran. The political power in Syria has always been with an Alawite Shia-led government in Damascus. And the Sunni Arab region of Mesopotamia has been cut into 2 political boundaries based in Iraq and Syria. Similarly, the Taliban is an ethnic Pashtun-based movement. It too struggles to expand anywhere beyond the ethnic Pashtun-based areas of Pakistan and Afghanistan, which too were divided into 2 countries during the colonial era, with the political center of Islamabad in Pakistan with the Punjabi elites. And in northern Afghanistan, the Taliban has also struggled to gain traction among the Uzbeks and the Tajiks, although it does have some control over Kabul, which is somewhat of a Pashtun city. Boko Haram, similarly, 70 to 90% of the members are Kanuris. That area, too, was divided among 4 countries. And Boko Haram, whether or not one ascribes to this Kanem-Borno lens of analysis, Boko Haram has almost exclusively operated in the Kanuri areas of Nigeria and has failed to expand to, for example, majority Hausa areas. So the idea of a caliphate, which Boko Haram, the Taliban, and ISIS all ascribe to, is likely appealing to these groups who feel that the nation state has not served them well, but a global Islamic community would probably treat them better by breaking down these borders. Because of Boko Haram's inter-ethnic and kinship links, it has been very easy for Boko Haram to expand, most recently to extreme north Cameroon, where Boko Haram has attacked and attempted to seize the 4 main border towns between extreme north and Borno State, and has used interior towns such as Waza, Kusuri, and Marawa as key arms trafficking and logistical networks in order to bring in arms and carry out attacks in Nigeria. And this is probably one of the most underlooked aspects of the insurgency, including the fact that 22 foreigners have been kidnapped in extreme north region since February 2012. And although all have been released, Boko Haram has received millions of dollars as well as weapon smugglers released from prison in these exchanges. And this has further bolstered its kinship networks as the intermediaries who negotiate on behalf of Boko Haram also get wealthier. The leadership of Boko Haram, too, reflects its socio-cultural networks. Muhammad Yusuf, the founder in 2002, was a Kanuri. He was killed in 2009 with 1,000 followers in Borno State. 2 interesting aspects about his ideology was that, first, he did talk frequently about how the areas of the former caliphate were broken up, and this weakened the people of Niger, the Muslims of Niger, Chad, and Nigeria. So he did have this political ideology, and he made it clear that his ideological icons were bin Laden, the Taliban, Sayyid Qutb, and Ibn Taymiyyah, some of the leading Wahhabists or Takfirists of the contemporary era. Yusuf's number 3 in command was Mama Noor, a Cameroonian, also Kanuri and Arab descent. He fled to West Africa after Yusuf was killed, reportedly Ghana, though that remains unclear. Nonetheless, he masterminded the UN headquarters attack in Abuja in August 2011 with Nigerian AQIM members, the type who later became part of this Ansaru faction that I discussed. Finally, Yusuf's third in command was Abu Bakr Shekau. Shekau was reportedly killed in July 2009. However, in 2010, some interesting developments emerged, with AQIM issuing 2 statements in support of the Nigerian Mujahideen and featuring a picture of Shekau in its statements, although it is doubtable that Shekau was actually with AQIM, so I presume that AQIM just took a different sub-Saharan African and said that this is Shekau. At the same time in 2010, another Shekau was emerging locally in Borno doing interviews in hideouts in Maiduguri, saying that I am Shekau and I'm still alive. So later we've seen at least 2 different varieties of Shekaus in terms of the rhetoric. One who is a clearly Al-Qaeda style Shekau, whose grammatical syntax in his speeches almost appear as if they must have been written immaculately by an Al-Qaeda member. And then another Shekau whose speeches are directed against President Jonathan and Nigeria, who's more of a Nigerian Shekau. The consensus has emerged among analysts of Boko Haram that there are multiple Shekaus in operation, including one Shekau who several weeks ago was reported killed, and we can almost identify by a distinct bump on his head that one of these Shekaus was killed south of Maiduguri. So 3 theories emerge. One is that Shekau was killed in July 2009, and there's been fake Shekaus ever since. Second theory is that Shekau survived in July 2009, and then was deposed and killed by rival factions, likely Ansaru, and that Ansaru has essentially usurped Boko Haram, but continued the Boko Haram name. Or that Shekau has just been alive this whole time, but used stunt doubles and stunt triples to make it more difficult for the Nigerian government, the US government, and others to locate him. And this is somewhat favorable for Boko Haram in that every time the Nigerian government claims to kill the Shekau, a new Shekau can appear to embarrass the government. It's also possibly favorable for the government, which can kill Shekau every 8 months and then rally the southern, the electorate to think that they're, winning the war. The recent developments related to the person supposed to be Shekau is that in his latest videos, at least dating for the past few months, no longer is Boko Haram showing the Boko Haram logo in the background of its videos, but it is showing the ISIS-styled Rayat al-Uqab flag as its logo in the background of videos. And it's also very interesting that in recent months, Shekau has declared support for Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS, and stated now twice that Boko Haram is establishing an Islamic State. And notably, in Shekau's latest video from about 2 weeks ago, the one in which the Nigerian Air Force pilot was decapitated, was that in the background for the 1 minute of the 1 hour video, when Shekau is talking about Islamic State, the Islamic chant or nasheed that plays in the background of the video is the distinctly ISIS sort of national anthem called My Ummah Dawn Has Arrived, which sounds like this. And that nasheed talks about the establishment of the Islamic State. That is likely not any coincidence, but it's likely an example of signaling via nasheeds. And actually, it appears that Boko Haram has frequently signaled through nasheeds in the past, as well as Ansaru. So, what does it mean if Boko Haram and ISIS have this sort of signaling or affiliational relationship? It to me means that a group like ISIS that cannot expand by territorial contiguity can expand via doctrinal or ideological contiguity. And we see an example of that in ISIS's magazine Dabiq from this past month in October 2014, when it cited as precedent the Nigerian Mujahideen as justification for ISIS's own kidnapping and essentially sexual enslavement of non-Muslim Yazidi women from northern Iraq, and saying because Boko Haram did that in Chibok, we can do that here. Similarly, some German ISIS members, such as Deso Dog, the former rapper, has called on Boko Haram to protect the Central African Republic Muslims and showed Boko Haram training videos in the background of his statement. Shekau, for himself, has also used distinctly anti-American rhetoric in his statements, like that of ISIS and Al-Qaeda, by saying that you are either with us or against us, Salafist Muslims, and if you're against us, we'll kill you. That's like George W. Bush's saying you're with us or against us. Similarly, Shekau has mocked Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address and said we're going to create a government of Allah, by Allah, for Allah. And most recently, similar to ISIS's military strategy to control territory, for the past 3 months, Boko Haram has begun to attack towns and hold them as opposed to attack and retreat. And estimates suggest that Boko Haram controls about 20 to 25 local government areas equivalent to counties in Borno State in particular. Boko Haram has also kidnapped hundreds, if not thousands, of young boys from these villages on the justification that it puts up on signposts in these villages that it's treason not to join jihad. So if you reject us, then we will kill you. Similarly, as evidenced by the Chibok school kidnapping, Boko Haram is taking captive hundreds of girls beyond only that school. And while some of them may be involved in negotiations, I would suggest that the majority are likely to be used as comfort women, like what happened in Asia in World War II, and that their children would actually be brought up in Boko Haram to be ideologically brainwashed from childbirth to be part of this group. Boko Haram has also begun implementing the very visible Sharia had punishments in Boko Haram controlled areas, just like the Taliban did before 2001. And notably, it has also been introducing new commanders and emirs in the local government areas that it controls. The first thing it usually does when it takes over a new local government area is to put up its ISIS-style flag in the most symbolic location of that town, usually a former emir's palace. And the fact that Boko Haram is now introducing new emirs and new commanders suggests that if Shekau is going to die, then there are people ready to replace him. And secondly, as it expands to different towns, it is prepared to set up its own government administrative leadership in those towns. So in conclusion, what we discussed was that there's an insurgency in the northeast and more of terrorism in the northwest. This means that there should be a different legal and strategic architecture to deal with the northwest and northeastern issues. Boko Haram continues to operate in the former Kanem-Borno Empire area, with the extreme north region of Cameroon under threat, and according to Boko Haram statements, possibly Chad next. New commanders and emirs are emerging, and Boko Haram is following the ISIS-style doctrine, as well as, it appears, its guerrilla strategy. One point on that is that Al-Qaeda's current leader, Zawahiri, who took over after bin Laden, has sort of neglected peripheral areas of the Muslim world, like the Philippines, like Indonesia, and like Nigeria. So this might be one reason why groups like Boko Haram, Abu Sayyaf, and Mujahideen Indonesia Timor are siding more with ISIS. In addition, Al-Qaeda does have concern about its public image, where ISIS does not really, and that's why AQIM factions such as Jund al-Khilafah, that is a inheritor of the GIA, a very violent insurgency, like Boko Haram, probably don't care about their public image, so these more violent groups are willing to side with ISIS, whereas they cannot with Al-Qaeda. Finally, recommendations. This is somewhat of a regional, at least sub-regional insurgency that requires a sub-regional approach. Because Boko Haram does receive weapons, if not also funding, from beyond the West African region, intel networks need to communicate to cut off these links. The Takfiri ideology, which is the common denominator of the global jihadist violent movement, needs to be combated, hopefully from within. Leaders in the Kanem-Borno area should be empowered through a development plan, and until Nigeria can rectify its own political squabbles, will it have enough energy to concentrate on the Boko Haram issue. Things to keep an eye on moving forward are elections in February 2015, possible involvement of France in at least stymieing the insurgency growing in Cameroon, because that's a Francophone country, largely. And finally, what will MEND and Niger Delta militants do if they are not liking what's happening in the political situation in the country based in the north? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jacob, for that very thorough exposition. And now I turn the floor over to Lauren Blanchard.
All right. Good morning. I'm Lauren Blanchard with the Congressional Research Service. If you're not familiar, we're sort of Congress's think tank. And if you hear any opinions out of my mouth today, they are my own. CRS does not take policy positions, but I sort of want to give a brief overview of the U.S. response to the Boko Haram threat. I think for all of those who are not so aware, U.S. policy towards Boko Haram and Nigeria's response reflects both the Obama administration's perception of the threat posed by Boko Haram and the strategic importance of the U.S. relationship with Nigeria more broadly. If any of you have heard former Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs Johnny Carson talk, you have heard him talk about Nigeria and how important it is to the United States in the context of U.S.-Africa relations. Nigeria, largest country population-wise, a regional behemoth in the region. When Nigeria catches a cold, West Africa sneezes, and that may apply more broadly to the continent. You may all be aware Nigeria earlier this year rebased its economy and is now the largest economy in Africa. Again, largest population in Africa with over 180 million people, and likely the largest Muslim population on the continent and one of the largest in the world. So there are a lot of superlatives to attach to Nigeria that sort of underlies the importance that the United States places in its relationship with the country. Interestingly, oil is no longer sort of one of the primary bases for that relationship. U.S. domestic production in oil has actually sort of allowed the United States to pull away from its reliance on Nigerian oil, and imports have gone down massively. I don't know what the latest percentage is, but we are no longer sort of a primary purchaser of Nigerian oil. Now the Asians have picked up the slack, I think the Indians and the Chinese, among others. First of all, let me talk a little bit about the administration's perceptions of the threat. I think by the latest statements from the White House and others testifying before Congress, the administration sees Boko Haram primarily as a threat to stability in northeastern Nigeria and perhaps the north more broadly. They also potentially see it as a threat to some of the surrounding areas in the neighboring countries, notably Cameroon, but also southern Niger. They also see Boko Haram and its attacks and its strategy as having the potential to fuel religious tensions more broadly in Nigeria. We've seen this with their targeted attacks on churches and on Christians in the north, and you certainly hear it in the Nigerian diaspora's engagement with Capitol Hill. Nigerian diaspora in the United States being primarily Christian. I think there is also concern on behalf of the administration that Boko Haram and or these elements with Ansaru that are linked with AQIM do pose a direct threat to Western targets in the region. Obviously, they did attack the UN offices in Abuja and have kidnapped and killed a number of Western citizens. I think that threat is still there. The possibility of a threat to the US Embassy or to other US facilities in Nigeria is a real one. In response, the US, first and foremost, designated back in 2012 three of the Boko Haram / Ansaru leadership as specially designated global terrorists. In mid-2013, they added Abubakar Shekau, the leader of Boko Haram, to the Rewards for Justice program, putting a $7 million bounty on his head. And in November of last year, added both Boko Haram and Ansaru to the foreign terrorist organization list and designated them as specially designated global terrorist SDGTs. Those designations empower both the Department of Treasury and Department of Justice and law enforcement agencies in the United States to pursue Boko Haram's financing in the United States, to implement travel bans as if Boko Haram members are traveling to the United States regularly. And there was quite a deliberation, particularly between Congress and the administration, some members of Congress, on that designation. If any of you are interested, we can talk about that in Q&A, but I don't want to get bogged down in it since it is a thing of the past. U.S. counterterrorism support to Nigeria has primarily focused over the last 5 or so years on building Nigeria's civilian capacity and law enforcement response to the threat. It is increasingly incorporating, although very, very cautiously, and when possible, some elements of military engagement, although I'll talk a little bit about why that's problematic. And also, it is increasingly incorporating programs focused on counter-radicalization. Until very recently, most of those counter-radicalization programs were in the Hausa language and focused on the North more broadly. They were not specifically tailored for the Northeast. I would personally consider that to be a bit of a shortfall in the U.S. programmatic response, but now USAID has upped their programming, and they are focused now on specifically the most affected states in the Northeast. And they've got sort of a complex program that is being developed. There is a fair amount of counter-radicalization messaging going on through a number of avenues, including through local religious leaders, radio, television programming. But again, the television programming, while it's very important, I think, for the broader Northeast, for areas, populous areas like Kano, more developed areas, television concentration in the Northeast, and particularly in Borno State, is quite low. So looking to other methods to get the message out and counter that takfiri ideology. In terms of security assistance, this is something I get a lot of questions about. I testified earlier this year on the issue of counterterrorism and security assistance to Nigeria. United States security cooperation with Nigeria is not small. It roughly runs around $16 to $20 million a year. In comparison with some of the other counterterrorism partners on the continent, notably Uganda, which is sort of the lead partner on the AMISOM response in Somalia, much bigger counterterrorism relationship with Kenya, also much bigger counterterrorism relationship with other Sahel countries, notably Mauritania and Niger, is much larger than it is with Nigeria. But let me talk to you about what that security cooperation with Nigeria consists of. It has been primarily focused on counter-narcotics and maritime security. We have a fairly good relationship with the Nigerian Navy and have done a lot of work with Nigerian law enforcement agencies to counter narcotics in the region. It has also incorporated a fairly significant amount of peacekeeping capacity building. The Nigerians have traditionally and historically been very large peacekeepers. Peacekeeping contributors, although there have been a lot of signs, particularly when they deployed to Mali last year, that peacekeeping capacity has weakened considerably. And I think that is a reflection of a broader problem that the Nigerian military has that really constrains our cooperation, and that is defense corruption and mismanagement. They are not putting their money into the right things. You find repeated reports in the Northeast where the Joint Task Force, that's the sort of combined military and law enforcement response to Boko Haram, is operating. You find a lot of reports that the vehicles don't have fuel in them, that they don't have ammunition for their weapons when they have weapons. They don't have armored vehicles. And as a result, you've had multiple reports of mutinies, very famous if you're following Nigerian press, incident where the Nigerian forces up in the 7th Division fired on one of their commanders. So you've had recently a number of court-martials of people for trying to desert or rise up against the mismanagement. This has been a critical message that the United States has been trying to send to the Nigerians. You have to get your house in order before we can engage. The other seriously limiting factor for our engagement with the military on their Boko Haram response has been human rights concerns. Very, very significant and widespread gross human rights violations associated with the Nigerian response in the Northeast, particularly in terms of detentions and sort of a broad response targeting basically any young man in the Northeast between the ages of 14 and 30. And that obviously has further alienated the government and the security forces from the population and makes it much more difficult for Western countries, notably the United States and the UK, which have been sort of the biggest security providers for the Nigerian government, in engaging. It's increasingly constrained our response. And as a result, the Nigerians have started to turn to some other security providers. Notably, there have been a couple of reports of new arms deals with Belarus, with Russian special forces planning to train some Nigerian elements, and I believe some armaments, helicopter gunships that they may be buying from the Czechs. Fast forward to April of this year, when the Chibok girls were abducted. I think you had pressure building within the administration to be doing a bit more to help the Nigerians. There had been a lot of dialogue through the Binational Commission. This is a regular defense and development dialogue, economic dialogue between US and Nigerian officials. A lot of sort of thinking about what more we could be doing to help the Nigerian government and prodding them to improve a number of these areas where they were falling short. When the Chibok girls were abducted, there was obviously, because of all of the international media attention, a great amount of attention from Congress and pressure from Congress on the administration. What are you doing to rescue these girls? And as a result, you saw a number of quick responses from the government, from our government. They sent out a big technical advisory team, both civilian and military, law enforcement, development officials, psychosocial support for victims, and also a few military advisors. And those military advisors have remained in Nigeria, probably have rotated out the people. And we have tried, when possible, to increase our information sharing. That information sharing, intel sharing, has been constrained. It is not the robust intel sharing relationship that we have with some other counterterrorism partners on the region and there are a number of reasons for that. Some of it is concerns about leakages potentially, and some of it is concerns about what the Nigerian government is going to do with that information in terms of potential human rights violations. The U.S. response since the Chibok abduction has also included expanded assistance to the families and victims of Boko Haram, and has included, if you look at any speech by Ambassador Entwistle in Nigeria or Obama administration officials, it will include some element of prodding to the Nigerians to adopt a more comprehensive counterinsurgency and counterterrorism approach, and so I think that is something that is heavily focused on. The United States, through the Global Counterterrorism Forum, has been trying to help the Nigerians improve the justice sector response, improve their ability to prosecute some of these Boko Haram members through the justice system rather than through extrajudicial means. That is seriously a work in progress. And I think going forward, there is hesitancy. There has been some hesitancy on the Nigerian side to take some of the assistance, particularly the training assistance that the United States has provided. The extent to which elections play into that and politics play into that, I think you see that play out, but it appears at the moment that the government thinks that it has gotten a reprieve through these arms deals that have been approved by the parliament. So work in progress. I think we're going to see Nigeria and the Nigerian government really trying to control the media on Boko Haram. And when I say control the media, I don't mean in terms of manipulating the press, although that may be happening. But they are certainly going to be looking for some easy wins as Jonathan approaches re-election. Obviously, the recent announcements about the negotiations in Chad, which offered some hope of rescue and return of the girls, seemed to be sort of tampered down by subsequent attacks by Boko Haram, and no sign that the girls have been released. So this government in Abuja, they need something tangible, I think, that they can show to the people before February. We'll see what it may be. So at that, I'm going to stop and we can do more in questions.
Thank you very much, Lauren. And now please join me in thanking Lauren and Jacob.